Welcome to you all. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you on behalf of Advocates for International Development, the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, and the University of Edinburgh Global Health Academy. My name is Yasmin Batliwala, the Chief Executive of Advocates for International Development, or A4ID as we are known. For those of you who don't know our work, A4ID is a global charity that believes the law can and should be used effectively to advance fair and sustainable development. A4ID aims to inspire and enable lawyers to join the global fight to eradicate poverty by advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Through A4ID, the world's top lawyers provide free legal support to organizations working to advance human dignity, equality, and justice. Our work so far has impacted on 130 countries. One of our programs, the Rule of Law Expertise, or ROLE UK, which is funded by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, aims to achieve long-term sustainable impact by supporting collaboration between the UK legal sector and legal actors in ODA eligible countries to strengthen the rule of law and to facilitate progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. It does so by focusing on improving laws, policies, systems, and practices by fostering and strengthening strategic partnerships and development-centric pro bono legal technical assistance. Now, this webinar came about as a result of a paper commissioned by A4ID's ROLE UK programme, which has been drafted by the Bingham Centre and also the Global Health Academy at the University of Edinburgh. During this webinar, we are going to discuss the rule of law in times of health crises, and our focus is on protecting rights and saving lives. Now, it would be fair to say that 2020 has been an extraordinary year for us all. It's been one full of challenges due to the pandemic, and in particular, how various nation states have actually had an opportunity to deal with it. Many of our fundamental values are under threat, leaving us to question what the future will bring. Even the rule of law itself is increasingly under threat the world over, when its relevance is perhaps more important than ever. So when a health crisis and the measures taken to deal with it have significant consequences for all, it is important to emphasize that the rule of law as a foundational framework enabling fair, open, and peaceful societies where citizens and businesses can prosper. Now, we will be exploring the intricate links between the rule of law and the health crisis and what indeed we have learned from them. Our session then will start with some introductory remarks, which will be followed by our panel of very impressive speakers who are going to share their thoughts and discuss the issues. We are keen to make this session also as interactive as possible to you all, so that you will have an opportunity to put your questions to the panel. And there will be a Q&A to do that at the end of the discussion. And this will be managed through the Q&A function on Zoom. Although I'm sure that we're all now increasingly familiar with Zoom webinars, as you can see, only the speakers will be visible and audible to you throughout the webinar. We'll also be using the chat function to share relevant links and resources with you as the conversation progresses, so make sure that you do keep an eye out on that. So without further ado then, I'm delighted to welcome my colleagues to make their introductory remarks. Firstly, we have Murray Hunt, Director of the Bingham Centre, who's going to provide us with a definition of the rule of law and also talk about the paper itself. And following him, we have Liz Grant, who's the Director of the Global Health Academy at the University of Edinburgh, and she will be providing a health perspective. Thank you. Murray, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Yasmin, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, first of all, to Yasmin, you and A4ID, and to Liz Grant and the Global Health Academy at the University of Edinburgh for the opportunity to collaborate on this very important topic and very, very timely, if I may say so. Emergencies, of course, put the rule of law under enormous pressure. Last week, we marked the 19th anniversary of 9/11. And that was a defining moment for many in the rule of law and international law and in the human rights community. And that was the emergency with which we have been most familiar in dealing with for the last 2 decades. Many of those in the international human rights and rule of law community have spent a lot of their time in those years dealing with responses to that emergency, which have caused really severe pressures on the rule of law and on human rights throughout the world. And certainly in my previous role as legal advisor to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, that committee's work for many years I was there was dominated by political responses to that particular emergency. And many of the international standards which govern emergencies have been developed in the context of that type of emergency, counterterrorism emergency essentially. But a public health emergency of international concern is a rather different kind of emergency. And it has a number of features which I think provide not only challenges to the rule of law and human rights, with which we're familiar from the other context, but also potentially opportunities in relation to rule of law promotion and advancement. A public health emergency of international concern is of its nature international, global in nature. It's universal, it affects all people in the world. It's against an invisible enemy, the virus, rather than an identifiable human enemy. It requires international cooperation to effectively counter it. But above all, I think the unique feature of such an emergency is that effective responses to pandemics such as the one we are living through at the moment require public trust in order to achieve compliance of the public and adherence to measures to try and combat the virus. And we now know from our experience of the last few months, it's been quite a steep learning curve, but we now know that low levels of institutional trust risk impeding the response to pandemics, as a recent Oxford University study found. And there's also evidence now beginning to emerge that the most effective responses have tended to be in those jurisdictions where there's a high level of public trust in their public institutions, such as in Germany, for example. And that gives rise to some interesting questions, I think, for us, as to whether there are, in this type of emergency we're living through, some opportunities to advance the rule of law, which we ought to seize at the same time as we are trying to defend the rule of law against the many challenges which the emergency has created and the response has created. And I just want to mention a few of those possible opportunities in these introductory remarks. There could be an opportunity to better articulate the relevant international standards for dealing with such emergencies. And I think that A4ID's work has taken an important step in that direction, better articulation in this particular context of the relevant international standards. And that might also give an opportunity to strengthen those standards in relation to this type of emergency. It's an opportunity perhaps to more systematically evaluate international performance against those standards, given the necessity for international cooperation and interrelationship and interdependence to be able to fight the virus. There may be an opportunity to experiment and innovate with new types of accountability, new forms of parliamentary scrutiny, for example, born of necessity, new forms of keeping courts open, which may have some beneficial aspects at the same time as they have those which challenge us. And there is perhaps an opportunity to renew our attachment to the importance of the multilateral institutions on which the rule of law and human rights depend, which are under such intense strain from political developments across the world. So my introductory remarks really are just to pose some questions for the discussion, as well as the many challenges. Are there opportunities here in articulating these standards better and furthering them in the future? So at that, I'd like to wish you all a very successful discussion. And I'm looking forward very much to hearing the conversation. Thank you.
And thank you. First of all, thank you so much, because it's tremendous to be here and to be in this partnership, a partnership that's hugely valuable. And I also want to thank Luciana Brondi, who's from our Global Health Academy and works at the Usher Institute here at the University of Edinburgh, a wonderful epidemiologist and intersectionality thinker who contributed much to this. So alongside welcoming you here, I want to just give a few words and comments about the context that we're working in, and also to ask that we think around the pandemic that we're facing in the world today as just one crisis in this basket of global crises that's happening concurrently, and that many of these global crises we've actually hear about constantly, but we choose, refuse, opt to respond to in small ways or big ways. We're in a world that has multiple crises, and the climate change crisis, the global warming is just one that is playing into the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic has been pushed by the climate change crisis, and we're seeing this extraordinary situation where there's multiple situations, multiple drivers, multiple risks, all coming together in what John Beddington described some time back in the past as a perfect storm. So we've got to really understand how this impact of the pandemic and the interventions to stop the pandemic actually really change the way that we respond to it. And I think here, as we think about the law, this becomes one of our huge issues. It's so hard to believe that, you know, it was only Christmas when we began to hear from what was happening in Wuhan about the SARS-CoV-2 virus, about this new coronavirus, this novel strain of SARS that was beginning to impact. And then on the 30th of January, Dr. Tedros, our WHO Director General, declared the public health emergency of international concern. The 30th of January this year, the 11th of March, that public health emergency was identified by Dr. Tedros as the pandemic that was affecting the whole world. And one of the messages that he said at that stage that I think is really critical for us thinking was that this is affecting everyone. This is affecting every sector of society. And because it's affecting every sector of society, every sector has to engage. Our World in Data, which has got tremendous resources, has said only if we end the pandemic everywhere can we end the pandemic anywhere. The entire world has to have the same goal. The cases of COVID-19 in the future, we have to change the way that, and we have to bring those cases under control. There's multiple issues. We know that this pandemic is different from the disease outbreaks of the past. We know its speed of transmission, its speed to morbidity and mortality is different. We know that this severe disruption to all sectors is different from what we expected or we had seen in many crises in the past. Though, can I draw you back to what I said at the beginning? Actually, while that speed is different, we know other pandemics, or other crises rather, have been affecting people just as hugely. Only we think about what's happening with the floods in so many places, what's happening with the locusts in the Horn of Africa destroying the food crops, what's happening with monsoons, what's happening with the fires in California, the fires in Australia. Those all are exacerbating, affecting certain communities. And here we have this pandemic responding to everyone. I want to leave us as we go to listen to the brilliant speakers on our panel, but I want to leave you with a concept, the concept of planetary health. And I'd like to think of that thread as we listen and as we come to the questions. Now, planetary health, it sounds rather exotic. It sounds almost galactic. What is this concept of planetary health? But it's so fundamental, I think, to how we think about the future of health going forward. It's actually something as ancient as ancient as our sacred texts and traditions, as ancient as our ancient peoples. Planetary health, quite simply, is the understanding that the health of humanity is so entangled and intertwined and interconnected with the health of the planet, the health of the air, the sea, the land, the health of ecosystems, and actually the health of societies, the health of the economics, that one has to flourish for the other to flourish. And if we're degrading nature, we're degrading ourselves. Humanity cannot flourish if we have destroyed and distorted the nature on which we depend on. And this concept is increasing in our ability to understand global health and our ability to understand what's happening. And the COVID pandemic has really, I suppose, shone a lens on what is happening in the world, and has said planetary health begins to give us an indicator of how we may move forward with the multiple crises. The Lancet Commission on Planetary Health in 2015 made this very searing comment that we have mortgaged the health of future generations for the development gains of the present. And actually the shock of COVID is that we realize we have actually mortgaged our own health. Health is at a crisis point. Health systems are at a crisis point. But going forward, as we think about how do we respond to this pandemic, how do we respond to the multiple crises that are working concurrently with this pandemic? And I think this afternoon we're going to discuss a little bit about that, discussing around why that intersection of law and health matters, why the understanding of the world as a whole, of humanity as a whole, of the equality of humanity, of the rights and justice that belongs to our humanity, but also belongs to the planet, why that understanding is going to make a difference, and also how we as individuals, we as nations, and we as international agencies and organizations need to come together collectively with a trust of a reimagined future. So thank you.
Thank you, Liz, and also thank you, Murray. We now move on to the panel discussion itself, which will be chaired by Alison, Maynard, Gibson, QC. Alison is the former Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs of the Bahamas. In this capacity, she has led initiatives to improve efficiencies in the administration of justice and in access to justice, including work with NGOs and civil society. Our panel, our speakers are, first of all, Micah de Langen, who is the Programme Lead for Justice for All, as part of the Pathfounders for Peaceful and Just and Inclusive Societies. Gianluca Berci, who's the Adjunct Professor of International Law at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. Gianluca is the former legal counsel of the World Health Organization. Lisette Robleto de Houth, who is the International Programs Manager at the Law Society of England and Wales. And last but not least, Naomi Bernard, who is the Roll UK Programme Manager at A4ID.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you joining us from various time zones around the world. As has been said, we are all being affected directly and indirectly by COVID-19. There are scores working in the rule of justice space, including human rights and access to justice. We are seeing scholarly papers and people speaking publicly and of course in webinars such as this. Today, we're going to try to maximize the benefit and privilege of having a conversation with those on our distinguished panel. I encourage attendees to send your questions directly to the Q&A function on Zoom throughout the panel discussion, and to like or give a thumbs up to questions that you would like to see answered. These will be returned to, we will return to them during the Q&A section of the webinar. Let's go straight to our panelists. Let's start with why we should be concerned about the rule of law in times of health crises. What is the connection between the rule of law and COVID-19 and any other crisis? Why is the strength of the rule of law important? And are we satisfied with states' response to COVID-19? And how has their response been impacted by the rule of law, including international law? Micah, shall we kick off with you?
Happy to. Thank you very much, Alison, for this introduction, and the other introductory speakers as well. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be on this panel. So it's interesting when in the introduction, you know, thinking back, and indeed it's only very recent that we have this this pandemic in a way, and so much has happened, and so much seems to be happening and changing every week. So what we did at the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies, where I work, when in the very early stages of this whole process in March and April, we developed a briefing on justice for all and the public health emergency. We had been working with the Task Force on Justice, of which Alison Maynard Gibson was also a member, actually one of the members of our Task Force on Justice, on this concept of justice for all. And then the pandemic hit, and we had to rethink what was happening and reflect really on justice actors and their role in this situation. So we have a briefing on that, Justice for All and the Public Health Emergency, again, that we reflected on these issues in the first phase. And it's interesting how, just like doctors, justice actors and nurses who you know we all focus on when we talk about health, but also justice actors were really at the front line of this pandemic from the very start. So they were engaged with enforcement of measures that were taken, and many of these measures were taken very quickly, had to be implemented very quickly, and so in many ways the daily interactions that people had with these justice actors shaped how the notion of fairness and justice in these early stages. We also focused on protecting justice actors both within the system and people within the justice system. So, you know, people working in prisons, prisoners themselves, how was their safety and security protected during this pandemic? And the other thing we saw, and I'm sure we'll cover that more, and I'll give the floor back to you, Alison, right after this. But the other thing we saw is that there is this amazing ability to adapt. And we often think about the justice sector as resistant to change, slow to adapt. But I think in these first weeks, courts, lawyers, paralegals, civil society organizations, police officers, there was such an energy of trying to find the best way to deal with these issues. And I think for people like I am myself, you know, arguing for change and improvement, that's actually something that is very positive, that there is a lot of change that can be done in a short time if we need to respond to new situations. The last, sorry, I'll leave it at that. I have more, but I'll leave it at that for now.
As we continue, I wonder whether Gianluca would like to talk a little bit about the international response. Is it affecting all of us around the world?
Yes, many thanks, and many thanks for inviting me. I'm a bit intimidated because probably I'm the least experienced in sort of rule of law discourse in the panel. But I was thinking of what Murray and Liz said, in particular, the effect of the pandemic on many aspects of our life and many aspects of national, international law. So this is a very fast-moving pandemic. Science keeps evolving. We keep improvising to a certain extent. We have new data that we have to interpret and also to manage politically every day. So it is a perfect storm from a also international law perspective. So in a way, what I was interested in and what I think coming out of COVID is the effects of health measures, of emergency health measures, or many other legal and political issues. First of all, on the quality of the laws. There are countries that had no emergency laws. My own country, Italy, had no specific emergency law. The government kept issuing decrees just based on loose provision in the constitution. And that's a big issue, I think, from a rule of law perspective. It leaves always a doubt of arbitrariness, the issue of trust, what is the scientific basis for this, what is the risk management for this, and so on. The second is the impact on human rights, and it's a huge issue. But from an international law perspective, it's regrettable and I think disappointing how many countries, including Western democracies, have not done what international law asked them to do, which is to declare an emergency, and they are derogating from the human rights obligation, but subject to a number of strict conditions and accountability mechanism. They haven't done so. And so they have deprived also the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, the various human rights monitoring bodies from the possibility of holding them accountable and drawing the line of what they were doing. The third is the quality of the law. One of the most disruptive aspects of the pandemic has been the disruption of trade. You remember in March and April, countries didn't have masks and the mask producers were just hoarding everything that they could. That was regrettable and I think something that shouldn't happen again. But from a legal point of view, there will be very little accountability because existing rules of trade law are very forgiving on these things. It will be very difficult to hold Germany or France or other countries or the US that were hoarding their own supplies and showing absolutely no solidarity to any kind of account. So the quality of the law, I think, will have to be reconsidered, and I hope there will be a debate on that. And finally, there is a big need to I think, clarify the rules of the game in terms of the management of risk. I think Lisa said very well, this is one of many emergencies. They are complex, they're interrelated, but emergency have to be managed on the basis of risk assessment and risk management principle, but also processes of democratic control and participation and so on. All this has been really shaken and challenged by the pandemic. And it needs, I think, a bottom-up discourse where the justice sector obviously will have to play a leading role. I'll stop at that for the moment. Many thanks.
I like the way that you've, that management of risk, you've brought it down to a business analysis. And Naomi, I wonder whether or not we could talk a little bit about that type of analysis that's not traditional in a legal setting, and perhaps speak about why the rule of law is so important to augment human rights. And then maybe we can move on to Lisette on the same point.
Thank you, Alison, and thanks to Micah and Gianluca. So I think Micah talked about how justice is actually at the front line of the pandemic response, and Gianluca also covered all of sort of the legal aspects from an international legal perspective about how the responses have interacted both with the pandemic but also with sort of concepts and principles of rule of law. Coming from a sort of programmatic and development perspective, I think it's also useful to consider an operational definition of rule of law and recognizing that rule of law is kind of a lofty philosophical concept, but viewing the rule of law as a framework in the first place, which ensures that public authority is bound by and accountable before pre-existing clear and known laws. Citizens are treated equally before the law, human rights are protected, citizens can access efficient and predictable dispute resolution mechanisms, and that law and order are prevalent. In the current times of difficulty and crisis to control the spread of the virus and to preserve health systems and human lives, we have witnessed these operational elements of rule of law being overridden across the globe in all nature of political systems. And there's a real concern and also some developments that suggest that these responses are not going to be temporary. And even if they are, the impacts of what has already happened will be long-term and are further exacerbating existing increasing global inequalities. It is important also to note that these inequalities aren't defined by nation state status, but are truly global challenges faced by all countries and peoples. So something that we see from A4ID in the Role UK programme's perspective is that a programmatic focus on and sort of application of the principles of rule of law can contribute to effective health crises response and recovery, you know, by promoting principles of transparency, clarity, encouraging participation, engagement and representation, and also looking at that, you know, recognizing what Liz had said at the very beginning about this being a planetary issue and the numerous planetary crises that there are happening at the moment concurrently, working on international cooperation, equality, accountability, and anti-corruption. So I think a key and ongoing question looking at the rule of law in these times of crises is how things progress, and to monitor how things progress from response to recovery, and also the status of rule of law in this journey.
Lisette?
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to say thank you to A4ID, the Bingham Centre and the Global Health Academy for the University of Edinburgh for this invitation. I'm also very humbled to be sharing this platform with very articulate and very knowledgeable panelists. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. I also want to thank you because you set the scene perfectly well. So thank you, Jean-Luc and Micah and Naomi for making my job a little bit easier. I want to sort of have a look a little bit at the key challenges of the rule of law and human rights under this crisis. And I want to borrow Liz Grant's a notion of multiple crises currently enveloping the pandemic. With regards to the challenges, it is evident that social and economic inequalities have become more apparent as a result of the pandemic, where the rule of law and human rights are even more at risk of being seriously undermined. Examples of backsliding include attacks to the independence of the judiciary, lawyers and court officials around the world. What I will do is now I'll try to concentrate and showcase through specific examples how they are illustrated with examples from the legal profession, gender equality and domestic violence. In terms of the legal profession, what we have experienced at the Law Society is that the targeting of lawyers for representing their clients through intimidation, imprisonment, direct threats and harassment seems to become a pattern that is continuing through the pandemic. And this is preventing lawyers from exercising their professional duties under the United Nations Basic Principles on the Right of Lawyers. These obviously directly impact on access to justice and the erosion of the rule of law. Since the beginning of the year, the Law Society has sent 17 intervention letters in support of lawyers in Colombia, Belarus, Turkey, Pakistan, Poland, Egypt, India, and China. And there is a general concern for imprisoned lawyers and human rights defenders, given the lack of appropriate prison conditions, which has now worsened as a result of the pandemic. In the case of Turkey, we released a joint statement in August alongside other organizations, Lawyers for Lawyers and the European Association of Lawyers for Democracy and Human Rights, where we drew attention to the exceptional threat posed by COVID to those in prison, especially Turkish lawyers who have not been released under the provisions of the recently introduced parole laws. Unfortunately, this has had serious consequences, and sadly, on the 27th of August, Ebru Timtik, a Turkish human rights lawyer, died after going on hunger strike in the pursuit of a fair trial for herself. Similarly, in the case of Iran, we've been following the case of Nasrin Sotoudeh, an Iranian human rights lawyer who's currently serving a very long prison in connection to her human rights work. Earlier this year, Iran temporarily released thousands of prisoners to deal with the overcrowding, sanitary concerns presented by the pandemic. But unfortunately, many human rights defenders and human rights lawyers were not released and were excluded from consideration and remain in detention. This has meant that Nasrin has begun a hunger strike on the 11th of August, demanding the release of prisoners held for political motives
and that are at risk of catching COVID. Given the previous situation with every tick in Turkey, we fear for the health and safety of Nasrin. More recently, we have been following the situation in Belarus, and on the 9th of September, we received reports that police conducted searches in the apartments of 2 Belarusian lawyers, but no accusation or charges have been brought against these advocates. And interestingly, over the last few months, in the exercise of their professional duties as lawyers, these advocates have been providing legal assistance to their clients, Viktor Babariko and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who took part in the presidential campaign 2020. Now I'll briefly make a few remarks in relation to the recent threats against gender equality. The ILO reported that gender gaps are still considerable and persistent in labor markets around the world, and this is especially threatening women because they have lower social protection coverage. In addition, the Arab International Women's Forum at a recent event presented that social norms and legal frameworks can exacerbate the constraint of women, especially those who are in lockdown, because they can be forced potentially to the return of traditional views on women in society. And they also risk having a double burden, especially in terms of caring responsibilities, education, and employment opportunities. What is more worrying, though, is that in a recent report published by the International Development Law Organization, is that there have been many committees organized in order to respond to the COVID, but these committees do not have equal male representation, in spite of the fact that women are representing right now some of the frontline personnel within the pandemic. And last but not least, I cannot help but to make references to the problem of domestic violence. And sadly, the COVID-19 has highlighted that societies around the world still have a long way to go in terms of protecting women. The recent wave of domestic violence and violence against women is a sad reminder that gender equality is still not there. In the UK alone, calls to the National Domestic Helpline increased by around 66%. Calls to the NSPCC helpline about the impact of on children increased by 32%, and the Metropolitan Police reported making 100 domestic violence case arrests a day. But what is more worrying is the anti-gender rhetoric and the so-called war on gender ideology employed by some governments to undermine the rule of law and human rights. After all, women's rights are human rights. The anti-gender rhetoric is insidious in that the impression to unite people around a concept of traditional values also demonizes and dehumanizes women, which are and other individuals who do not conform to gender norms. And in that regard, it is worrying to report that in July 2020, the Council of Europe expressed its alarm on Poland's announcement that was moving to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, a landmark international treaty aimed at preventing violence against women. So it is in that context that the challenges to the rule of law still prevail and are continuous. And it is in that landscape that justice operators have to exercise their professional duties in order to continue providing access to justice to the many that are suffering the consequences of COVID. And on that, I stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisette. I like that you, Naomi, has set out the Bingham principles that are required to be satisfied so that a jurisdiction can be verified that it in fact has a strong rule of law component. And you've of course spoken, Lisette, about the human rights violations that are, thank you for giving us those full details, such a fulsome list of details. Murray and Liz spoke about the challenges and opportunities that exist. And I wonder, as we move forward into the context of planetary health, let's call it, that also impacts human rights, when we think about the various, and I think it was Yuji and Luca that spoke about the possibility of rating countries' responses. And we know that the UN, it has its annual biennial periodic review of countries. I wonder whether Micah and Gianluca would like to speak to, at least start off on this topic. How do we respond to these challenges so that there is some collaboration and order, if possible, brought to the world response? And what about a rating like exists, or a rating procedure as exists for the Universal Periodic Review? I wonder whether Gianluca and Micah might like to kick off with that aspect, please.
Should I give it a start? Yeah, it's a very important question, because obviously states are very reluctant to be rated, are very reluctant to be to be made accountable against the will and so on. So I hope we have a window of opportunity to push in that direction. That window will close. And as you said, or somebody said, this is a tough time for multilateralism. One of the paradoxes of the COVID crisis is something so global and so indiscriminate that should have called for a more coordinated, more in a way rational, common response, has seen instead neighbors closing the doors on neighbors, vaccine nationalism, and exactly the opposite reaction of what we would have expected from a almost like a rational choice perspective. So I think if I can maybe give a 1 minute of response from a health perspective. As you know, everybody's been speaking about international health regulations in the last few months and the role of WHO. This is in a way the global instrument to try to prevent and control what we have. The level of compliance has been uneven. The reluctance to accountability has been very visible. What can be done? In my views, a few things. First of all, you need, I think, a strong push from civil society, from sectors other than governments, to impress 2 or 3 things. The first is that national health systems are no longer a national prerogative that nobody can touch, have become a matter of international concern. It's not very different from what human rights were in the 1940s. All of a sudden, how states treat their population is no longer purely domestic, is a matter of legitimate international concern. There are obligations and there is accountability. I think the same things should happen and will happen for national health system, because what is happening in the hospitals in Lombardy, in northern Italy, has immediate repercussions on the whole of Europe, given how connected we are. What happened at the wet market in Wuhan, China, evidently has affected the whole of mankind. So it is absolutely illogical to say that these are a matter of purely national concern. I think we need a push in that direction and to create instruments for accountability. This shouldn't be antagonistic. In my view, the actual rating or naming and shaming, I'm not a big believer in that. That creates only antibodies, creates nationalistic reaction, creates sometimes the opposite effect. In my view, you need more collaborative mechanisms, joint assessment that looks at the lack of resources before you look at the bad faith or political decisions. You need an incentive to comply and collaborate, and deterrence to close the door, to tell lies, not to reveal what's happening in your territory, and so on. So I hope we have a conversation of this nature. I think you see the start of it in WHO. There are several reviews going on that will land in the World Health Assembly, the plenary body of WHO, next year. And I do hope that there will be some bold but realistic ideas that will get some political traction.
Shall I jump in on that, Alison? Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very intriguing question you asked there, and I think it is good to think about ways to move forward in this area, especially because one of the key elements, I think, of the rule of law is that the rule applies equally for all, and everybody agrees that that's true in a normative sense. But we are so far from that in reality in every society in the world. And if anything, this pandemic has made that much more visible and much more tangible, and also much more urgent, I think, for justice leaders to address. And that ranges, I think, from some of the examples that Gianluca gave on how states were behaving internationally, what that means, translating into impact in their countries, but also very much, of course, in people's lives, and the big difference in impact on people's lives, both of the health impacts, the economic impact, etc., etc. So I really think this notion of rule of law and justice systems and rules applying equally to all requires a lot of work in the normative sense, but so much more in the empirical sense. So not so much the law on the books, but the law in action. And I think justice leaders, I very much like the suggestion that Gianluca just made about more collaboration internationally. I think the justice sector traditionally isn't very good at working together internationally. There's very strong notion that every system is different, which of course is true. At the same time, we all face very similar problems, especially now. We're all in this together in the sense of societies and people trying to find ways to deal with this and to respond to that. So I really think there's an urgency for justice leaders in a broad sense. I take that in a very broad sense, to work together internationally, to learn from each other, compared to the health sector, where I think there's almost 100,000 papers on COVID have been published and shared, and there's this much more mechanisms for sharing knowledge and learning as a sector. So I think that would be helpful. You mentioned this idea of rating and whether UPR mechanism might help. I think if we can find, we have a set of goals that have been set for the world, the Sustainable Development Goals, agreed by world leaders in 2015. We have SDG 16, which explicitly says we should ensure equal access to justice for all. So I think finding ways to work together towards those goals may be a more constructive way of working together and making change. Of course, when you look at what justice sectors are facing now, we've written about this in our second briefing on the pandemic and the economic crisis. They're in a way in a triple crunch because the demands for justice are increasing. Funding is going to go down because we're in an economic crisis globally, and demands and the restrictions on operations will continue to apply, at least for several months, if not a year or more. So that finding ways to work through that and finding solutions, I think, is something we can do together, and having some collective exchange around that can be very helpful.
Naomi, this webinar has been brought together by clearly your entities, the Role UK, Advocates for International Development, the University of Edinburgh, etc., recognizing this exact point of the need for collaboration to accomplish everything just about everything that's been spoken of already. I won't repeat it. I wonder whether, from a practical standpoint, you can speak of the challenges. And might I also ask, because we're dealing internationally with, let me call it, political will to accomplish these goals as well.
Yes, thank you, Alison. So it is really interesting that there is sort of an interesting situation we find ourselves in, where there's so much evidence for the need of collaboration on a global level, and yet sort of the direction everyone seems to be going in a slightly different direction. I think that there are challenges of collaboration. However, I think one of the things that's interesting about this time of crisis and this time of multiple crises, as Liz highlights, is that it has really made everyone, I think, far more aware of how much of a mess, I guess, we're in on so many levels. And I think that has actually galvanized a lot of conversations at all levels. I think from a collaborative perspective, one of the things that at A4ID and on the Role UK programme, we really believe in the value of collaboration, and not only sort of bringing in the legal sector and legal actors at all levels, but also across sectors as well. So not only having intersectional collaboration, but also intersectoral collaboration. And so, you know, one of the examples of this actually happening in reality is that A4ID have been working closely with our legal partners representing large international law firms of all shapes and sizes to integrate the sustainable development agenda and rule of law into their pro bono practices, with some international law firms already starting to utilize the sustainable development agenda as the core of their responsible business strategy. And we found that that sustainable development agenda, although you might call me slightly idealistic, has been a really interesting and useful framework to galvanize conversations. And I think there's a real question for both the development sector, but also the legal actors who are involved in this, about how we bring that conversation more widely and more into sort of a wider discourse. With the Role UK programme, the UK legal and judicial pro bono sectors are working in partnerships across the world, sharing experiences and capacity building to improve the rule of law. So there are already some really amazing examples, and I think Lisette will be able to talk through some more, where those conversations have started and are happening, and what we want to do is galvanize them towards both the SDGs, but also the COVID-19 recovery.
Before we go to the Q&A, I wonder whether each of Lisette, Gianluca, and Micah would deal with, speaking in the international arena still, Lisette, the Beijing 25 plus goals together with the SDGs, the goals 2030. Gianluca, whether you would speak about the challenges that the WHO faces, especially because of feedback in by certain countries under the defunding of WHO as well, or the threat thereof anyway. And Micah, whether you would speak a little bit more about the view of the Task Force on Justice and its response to these challenges. And then we will move to if the three of you could take it in that turn, then we'll move to the Q&A section, please.
Thank you. Yes, I will talk a little bit about what obviously the SDG 6 and SDG 5 and SDG 16. SDG 5 is relating to gender, SDG 16 is relating to access to justice, etc. Are very relevant to the legal community. And there have been many reports that says that with the pandemic, it is more than likely that the fruitful accomplishment of these goals will be seriously hampered by the pandemic. What it is more worrisome, though, is that what we need to remain vigilant about the implementation of legislation that has been adopted during this period in relation to the emergency legislation or emergency decrees that have been put in place in different jurisdictions. In the case of the Law Society, we are at the moment preparing a report that will be released on the 25th of September to mark the 6 months anniversary of the Corona Act in the UK. Where we are going to be making a series of recommendations asserting that emergency measures must be temporary and should be fully justified if the threat remains sufficiently serious and if they interfere with rights only to the extent that it's strictly necessary. That is extremely relevant to the rule of law, and I think this particular oversight from civil society organizations could be done, as Naomi was stating, in partnership with others. I think, and I totally concur with Micah, that sometimes justice operators are not very keen in collaborating with each other, and this is something that we need to constantly overcome. In terms of things that we can do for the future, I think the legal profession has a lot to offer in terms of capacity building and sharing experiences, because legal reform is very important. So unifying those responses and raising awareness about the plight and the challenges of the legal sector and justice operators is extremely key under the current circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. Gianluca? Could you unmute yourself, please, Gianluca?
Apologies. Having worked almost 20 years in WHO, I have to declare my bias in favor, so I'm not entirely neutral or impartial. I think what we saw with COVID, first of all, shows the precariousness of the life of international organizations. They always teeter between an assertion of autonomy and how dependent they are on the politics and the support or lack of support of key states. What I found interesting and probably resonates from a rule of law perspective is this tension between politicization, how WHO in a way, whatever it may have done wrong, whatever mistakes may have done, is the victim of a geopolitical struggle between the United States and China largely. It's caught in between, and in a way, nothing it can do can be right in the eyes of the Trump administration. It's very difficult to find a space of maneuver for an international organization in those situations. At the same time, you've seen a lot of support from Western European countries, from many other countries, for the role of WHO as a functional technical organization that tries to occupy a neutral space of again, what I said before, proper risk assessment and risk management based on credible, transparent, science-based criteria that are not arbitrary, but they are justifiable and plausible, because otherwise people just wouldn't follow. This is not a binding decision, it's a guidance that needs traction to the extent that it's considered credible, authoritative, and legitimate. So I think it's a very interesting tension and very interesting dynamic, which in my view, even though with all fits and starts, is going in the right direction, because you see a lot of support for this role played by international organizations. Can be WHO today, can be the UN tomorrow, can be FAO the day after. But in a way, it goes back to like a legitimate role for government in an emergency equals a legitimate role for an international organization, like a collective agent of governments in the guidance of international response to the organizations. I find pretty interesting if you take a step back and look at it from a more conceptual perspective.
Thank you. Yes, so happy to say a few more words on the Task Force on Justice, although you were, of course, a member of the task force, so please add to that if you like, Alison. The Task Force on Justice came together to really look at the promise of SDG 16, brought together a number of countries and organizations to think of how this promise of making justice available to all could be realized, and so it has. In its final report, the Justice for All report, we set out. We presented the first measure of the global justice gap. So where are we? Where do we want to go to? And we proposed a different way of thinking about these issues. Of course, as lawyers, we like to think about structures and rules and procedures, but really trying to turn the narrative on its head and focus on people and the most common problems that they face in their daily lives. And then think pragmatically about how these can be resolved. And that brings you to a wide range of justice actors. And the current problems that people face are, of course, related to the pandemic. Both direct impacts around health and access to public services, but also, the economic crisis. People are worried about their employment. People are debts are exploding, evictions, all kinds of problems that people face in their daily lives that require appropriate answers and better answers, quite frankly, from the justice sector. And so in the report, I won't go into it too much detail, because I know there's a number of questions that have been asked and we want to get to those. But we do emphasize the need to focus on problem solving, on taking a diversity of actors working together in the justice sector. And we've applied that in much more detail in our briefings, which look specifically at the pandemic. So I invite everyone to have a look at that. And please, I'm happy to be contacted for more details. Just on this, this broader question of, sorry, I wanted to quickly say a few words on that as well, if you allow me, Alison, on justice for women, which is an important component of this work. UN Women has called for attention for the shadow pandemic, as it calls it, the pandemic of domestic violence, which is actually a shadow pandemic to the coronavirus pandemic, because of people being forced to stay at home, and home not being a safe place for everyone. So I do think that's a specific area that requires work, and continues to require work in this field, and really focusing on responses to that situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's move to the questions, and I would urge those who are listening to please continue to put your questions in the Q&A, and those who are watching also to put your thumbs up for those questions that you would like most answered. Micah, your last comment, and Lisette, helps us to move smoothly to one of the questions, and that is, in response to the comments on women's rights, how can we continue to advocate for women's rights when these rights become less of a priority when faced with global health and economic issues during this pandemic? Please, any of you take the question, any or all of you.
I think that is precisely the point. The point is that women's protection and safeguards are pushed to a secondary element rather than being continuously protected as they should be. And in fact, Micah made a fantastic reference to that shadow pandemic. And equally, Gabriela Ramos from UNESCO highlighted that 31 million additional cases of gender-based violence are expected to emerge over the next 10 years as a result of COVID. There have been many studies around the world that assert that domestic violence has not only have a physical and a mental impact, it also has an impact on the economy. Therefore, it requires a leadership from many governments around the world to ensure that this situation is addressed. It is not an issue that is a might, it's a must. Women are rightful citizens who should be enjoying their full human rights in any context, regardless of COVID. And the problem that we've seen, and this is something that also appears in the report that will be published next week, is that nearly half of solicitors have seen an increase in the number of domestic violence cases, and that is in the UK. So it is paramount that when we are designing policies to address the pandemic, we also consider these issues at the forefront of the design and implementation of policies. Thank you.
Michael, both the elders and the task force have also responded to this particular issue. I wonder whether you might, before the others, before Naomi and Gianluca jump in, want to say something about that?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Alison. I mean, there's a lot of attention has been drawn to the topic. Of course, the question is, how do we really change it? UN Women is an important partner to the work that we've been doing at Pathfinders, and they have a campaign on leveling the law, which I think is a long-term goal. There's still discrimination in legal systems, entrenched in legal systems, that needs to be taken out. And I think UN Women has a broad program to systematically work on that. Much more in the short term, I think, is a couple of issues are important to address. One is empowerment of women to play their role in the economy, and to be able to play their role in the economy and in society, and that is partly a legal question, but partly also a broader question in terms of informing women and girls of their rights, creating solutions for the problems they face, and they can be very practical. As long as the systems, in the broad sense of the word, are designed with men in mind, then the services are going to be more difficult to access for women. And you mentioned indeed the elders who have a program very much focused on access to justice, and they have been drawing attention to this issue also also systematically and also in the review of the Beijing 25 platform. So they are working in that area as well. Thank you.
Before I move on to other questions, I don't know whether Naomi or Gianluca would like to jump in on this.
Just very quickly, I think that one of the things that is really important to remember, and I sort of echo some of the things that were said at the very beginning and the things that we've been sort of talking about in our panel discussion, is that, you know, as Lisette rightly says, women's rights are human rights. But I think that the key thing is to remember and sort of, I guess, maintain the messaging that everything is interconnected. Women's rights, economic rights, health rights, all of these are part of the same sort of, I guess, humanity question and challenge. And I think that, again, similarly to, you know, what I've said previously, I think that intersectoral approach and bringing different voices is really important. So tackling these issues from a legal perspective, but also looking at advocacy and also what the development community are doing as well. So, you know, there's a huge focus, thanks to UN Women and in the development agenda as a whole, on gender-based violence and violence against women and girls. And I think that bringing all the different angles to that conversation and viewing the challenge holistically is really a key way of sort of progressing forwards and trying to find a way forwards on this issue.
If I make a very quick follow-up, listening to Naomi, it's not about gender, but something that really has been struggling, and it's a question, it's not an answer, is the economic and social rights. I mean, the COVID has been an absolute catastrophe from an economic and social right perspective. Destitution, loss of jobs, loss of schooling, deprivation of healthcare. It's been an absolute catastrophe. And when you have a situation where millions and millions of people all of a sudden are in a situation which can be characterized as a breach of rights that should be guaranteed by treaties ratified by their own countries, is the human rights system we have, which is based on an individual claim, on the fact that you need an individual victim that makes a claim against the state, is that still an adequate narrative? Is it still an adequate language? Is it still responding to the magnitude of this phenomenon? Or we need something more? When Prime Minister Modi imposes a lockdown in 6 hours, not caring whether millions of migrant workers will survive, how does that translate into something which is actionable from a human rights perspective? That doesn't sort of trivialize human rights, but is that enough? We need something more, I think. Yeah, that's just a question.
Well, let me add some more questions that are in the box on the same point before you distinguished panelists answer them. The first is, how do we capitalize on the ability to make effective changes in laws to deal with COVID to address the overarching global climate ecological crisis, with, of course, the appropriate checks and balances and international standards to protect human rights? And that is augmented by a related question: what should legislatures do to protect human rights during the COVID emergency? And are there examples of good practice? I hand it over to any of you that wish to take that on.
I might just start very generally, because it's a huge question and a big challenge. And, you know, this is the key thing we're all facing and grappling with today. And it's such a, you know, enormous crisis and series of multiple crises that we're living in at the moment. And I think one of the things, and an emerging issue really seems to be, is that both the COVID-19 crisis and actually all of the crises that are happening at the moment are all being dealt with on an individual basis, sort of in an individual national basis, and also as competing priorities. So with siloed responses and recovery plans, especially in terms of public health and economic recovery, especially, you know, we've seen certain things in the UK around sort of restrictions on gatherings, but then sort of emphasis on going back into the offices. And so that sort of disconnect is really something that seems to be prevalent. And I think that that's a real challenge and a sort of a push and a need, an area of advocacy that needs to be taken forwards with legislatures and governments and for everyone who's involved in this work to make sure that interconnectedness is really, really emphasized and is really part of the considerations that take place. I think a lot of, as Gianluca highlighted initially, everything has been quite responsive, and that's as it's had to be. However, as we move forward into sort of a recovery phase, hopefully, looking at that interconnectedness is really, really important.
Gianluca, do you want to talk about the international standards that may need to be in place?
Yeah, as Naomi said, that's indeed a million-dollar question. It's basically what people have been talking about, to build back better. Never waste a good crisis and try to come out of it better, or go back to the status quo and just muddle through. That to me is a function of the, in a way, national system, whether they are solid, resilient democracies that can start that kind of discussion. To me, goes a lot to local rule of law, democratic political cultures. But also should build on what the question was referring to as good practices. And good practices, to me, they should be also a points of reference internationally. So again, if you study international relations, you have sort of rational choice. You have all theories that imply that states are rational actors that will choose what they perceive as best for them. The point is, how do you influence the choice? And there I think there is a role for international organizations in building best practices that are not just pure wishful thinking, but are solid and build on experience, because we can't deny what we've been going through for the last few months. But also there is a huge need of bottom-up pressure, civil society and so on, to push in the right direction. Otherwise, unfortunately, many politicians will just go back to what gets them, elected in the next elections, and we don't go very far in seeing what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic and so on. So I would say political culture, a role for international actors, and bottom-up push to create accountability, to create a space for that kind of discourse. But personally, I'm not too optimistic.
I'd like to add two more questions as Lisette and Micah weigh in. And that is, how do you respond to the concern that due process, rules, and procedures tend to hinder the speed that may be necessary to respond to the emergency? And added to that, is there a role for corporate accountability in this process, especially as it involves human rights? I'd like to add it to the big question that we referred to earlier. Micah and Lisette?
I'll try to respond to add to what Gianluca said and try to respond to the last question. I think I do have sort of mixed feelings in terms of the lessons learned in terms of outcomes after the pandemic. One thing that we need to emphasize quite strongly, and we need to demand, is that our political leaders should adopt clear and consistent messages in terms of how we are going to rebalance the economic prerogatives with other prerogatives such as social protections, climate change, and other issues alike. I think one thing that we need to be very mindful of is that sometimes the economic prerogatives become secondary to, or become primary to social protection. You prioritize that in terms of climate change, or instead of social protections or other social policies. We also need to consider that when we are designing global policies, we have the best interests of the global community in mind. Sometimes when we design or when we enter negotiations, we have national interests at heart rather than interests of the global community, and that is something that needs to be addressed by our global political leaders as well. In terms of practices, I think one lesson learned from the pandemic is that certain practices that were somewhat impossible, like working from home or flexible working, are now being proven to be a reality and a possibility. And that opens up many opportunities for many people that up to now haven't been able to access those different, that flexibility in the labor market. So certainly that could bring other opportunities as well. And just finally, in terms of the corporate private sector, I think the private sector can play a fantastic role, not only in terms of partnering with those enterprises, that are generating capacity building projects, or even in terms of influencing and advocacy. I think they have a very powerful role to play, especially when they are considering where to invest, how to invest, what environmental prerogatives must be considered when they are investing in a country. And those are only a few things to mention. They are definitely a motor that can be constructive for the future. Thank you.
Micah, did you want to chip in?
Sure. I think it's become a wide range of questions, so I'm just going to pick out two elements that I'd like to respond to, if you allow me. First, the issue that Gianluca raised of individual complaints in this complex human rights system at the global level, and whether that's the right mechanism. I mean, I think that's definitely an interesting question. At the same time, it made me think of course, individual rights, especially economic and social rights, do matter very much at the individual level. So, I mean, we all know the quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, where after all the human rights begin in the daily lives of I don't know it all by heart, but in the daily lives of men and women around the world, in places close to home, etc. And so if you look at that impact of human rights and the economic, social rights in particular, and I refer back then to this global justice gap that we did some work on for the Task Force on Justice, where we estimated that 5.1 billion people are unable to stand up for their rights, and a large part of that is because they don't have identity papers, or they don't have papers, they work in the informal sector, or they have gig jobs, or they don't have a title for where they live. And so if you don't have those basic elements in place, it's very hard for the individuals to stand up for their rights in the specific situation. And having to take a situation all the way to the global courts is I think out of reach for many. But being able and empowered to stand up for your rights in the context in which you live, I think is very important. And we do require the broader structures and investment in those structures to work on that. And pressures, I think, are rising everywhere, not just from the bottom up, but from all sides, I would say, of really addressing some of these issues. The other point I would like to address is this issue of due process, and the question that was framed. And it's interesting how there's different ways to look at that. Of course, due process is important. There's no lawyer, I think, who would deny that. At the same time, it is sometimes also used to, it leads sometimes to procedures and ways of working that are very slow and complex and distant from how people experience how distant from people's daily lives, and that makes the whole interaction perhaps alienating. And I think that's also a very important. So I'm not saying do away with due process, not by any means, but I think we have to find ways of protecting the process and giving people ways to address their rights, but also much more pragmatic solutions for the large number of issues that we are facing and we will be facing, and navigate the differences. And if you have a simple unemployment claim, which may be critically important to you, finding a simple solution and an easy way to address that is maybe more important than having all the due process and having your answer in 18 months. So I don't know if I'm expressing this well, but I think that's a challenge we have to work on in the justice sector. How can we work smarter and more efficiently and effectively and more relevant to people's lives with, while we do have those opportunities for appeal and due process, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a nice, thank you, Michael. That highlights some of the concerns that have been raised by the other speakers and our introductory speakers. And it's a nice segue to another question that has been raised, and it touches on emergency powers. What are the specific concerns of the panelists on the use of emergency powers, and especially they are, because they so often are prolonged? And related to that, should there be accountability when we speak about public confidence for those in positions of power who misadvise scientifically? Should they be held criminally liable? Should there be gross negligence, manslaughter, and so forth, as these decisions can affect people, including so far as death? And I wonder whether or not, Naomi, you might want to start off on that, and then any of the other speakers. Gianluca, I think you've touched on this as well, as you all have.
Yes, I guess to start off with, thank you, Alison. I think accountability lies at the heart of sort of the rule of law and what we're sort of speaking to today. And I think that it is something where, as time goes by, and obviously we are looking forward to a second wave of COVID-19, and we're facing those multiple crises as outlined at the outset, it is a really interesting journey for everyone to look at, because I think accountability requires energy. And there's sort of, I do feel like personally, at least, that there's a sense of fatigue as time goes by. And I think that that's something, and sort of the messaging around holding people accountable and how to do so is a conversation that really needs to start happening more actively. And that discourse needs to step up really, both from a legal perspective, but from a development perspective as well, and also from the bottom up. Like, that question of accountability is really at the core. How that transpires is a really key question. I think something that the legal community should and could grapple with. But I think also it's just about trying to raise the voices and try and, I guess, think about the communications outwards to the wider populace and populations about how to start that conversation and really deal with it. And that's sort of, I guess, yeah, my initial thoughts.
Gianluca, what about the use of emergency powers nationally and internationally, and how they affect people's rights?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And I think there is a very concrete risk of streamlining these measures, frankly. I mean, some of the restrictions or the measures that were imposed after 9/11 are still with us. If I fly to the United States, all my data will be given to the US. That's one of the effects of 9/11. If I use a credit card, the data will be stored somewhere, God knows where, by an intelligence agency in the US. So to me, what's happening now, and in particular from a surveillance point of view, which is a legitimate tool to trace contacts, to try to prevent worse outbreaks, but the risk is so evident. And it's equally insidious because, in a way, the devastation of COVID can make it very plausible for a government to say, okay, COVID is over, but we cannot let the gas down. We need to be prepared for the next pandemic because it may come. And so that justifies streamlining and perpetuating these measures. What can you do about that? I think there is definitely a role for the judiciary. Even in the US, in the post 9/11 era, it was federal courts and state courts that struck down some of the most incredible measures imposed by the Bush administration. And it's a counterbalance to the abuse of power. And also the Trump administration shows some aspects of it. So I think there is a role for judiciary in ensuring that laws are respected, but also the spirit of the laws, not just the letter. And again, there is a question of build back better. There is, I think, healthy reactions by the academic community, by civil society, by political parties. So I think it's a shared responsibility of the judiciary, of the academic community, of political parties, and so on. But definitely, frankly, I'm very also from my own perspective, kind of very nervous of what can happen in the next few years, how it can impact in very insidious way in my sphere of privacy and so on.
Let's right back looking at our time to our headliner, which is the rule of law. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, persons who have passed in your questions. And looking at the time, I hand back over to you, Yasmin, and as I thank the panelists and those who've put questions in the Q&A box.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Alison. And so to finish, so I'd like to thank Alison, and I'd like to thank all the members of the panel for a most enlightening session. I'd like to also thank you for joining us today, and hope that you found the session both informative and also thought-provoking. I'd also encourage you to read the paper and listen to the podcast, which this event is based upon. And the authors, Yulinda Becherai, John Pierre Gauci, Ni Yasha Weinberg, and Luciana Brondi, have all shared their views on the podcast, so it's really worth listening to. The link for this will be found in the chat function if you look at it now. As usual, also, we have a short survey, as we'd really keen to have your feedback on this event. So we'd be grateful if you could spend a couple of minutes completing it after the session is over. Details of this again will be found in the chat function. So then I'd like to close the session by thanking you again for joining us today, thanking our wonderful panel, and I hope you remain healthy and safe. Thanks a lot.